So in this video, we're going to continue with our discussion of measurement by focusing in more depth on the key ideas of validity and reliability. And we'll begin with validity, which, if you remember from the basic measurement model that we started off with, refers to how well the measure reflects or captures or represents the true construct, the thing that we're interested in measuring. So how well does our measure of poverty reflect the true poverty of a family or a community, and how well does let's say a English language arts test capture a child's real language ability. And so we want to know how well our measures really get at what we want to measure. Now, there are a couple ways to judge this, and one is just using our subjective assessment, in a sense, of how good the measurement is. And so sometimes we can just look at a measurement and make a judgment as to whether we think it's valid or not. So we may look at might review the questions on a language arts test and say, well, on the face of it, does it look like it captures what we want to measure? Or we could look at, for example, the self-esteem scale, which we looked at in the previous video, and look at those statements and say, well, do they really capture what we mean or think about when we conceptualize self-esteem? And if we agree that they capture the concept, then it has face validity. If we think the statements are off or the questions are not good, then we would maybe question its face validity. Related to that, another kind of judgmental way to look at validity is content validity. We might be interested in judging how well the measurement captures the full range of what we mean by, let's say, reading ability. So a standardized test maybe measures vocabulary and small sentence comprehension, but it may not capture more in-depth reading comprehension, like how well a student understands a novel when they read it, or it may not capture writing ability because it doesn't include a writing component to the test. So if we have concerns like that, we would say the measurement may have limited content validity because it doesn't capture all of the dimensions that we care about or hope to measure. Now, those are judgmental approaches. Another way to think about validity and to assess it is to use empirical strategies, and that's broadly referred to as criterion-related validity, meaning there's a criterion or criteria out there that we use to see how well our measure gets at what we want to measure. And there are different, there are all kinds of validity. You don't need to focus on these particular subtypes of validity, but just to give you an idea of what these strategies are, there's concurrent validity, which means to compare a measure with some measure of the same thing to see, usually a better measure of the same thing, to see how valid our measurement is. So we give the example in the book of self-reported drug use, which can be compared to hair samples or urine samples that can detect actual traces of drug use in the body. Obviously, that's a more expensive, intrusive form of testing for drug use. So, but it could be useful to do just to see how accurate self-reported drug use is. And it turns out that, as you might expect, that people underreport drug use if you just ask them questions in a survey. So that would be a way to show that a measurement that's using a concurrent validity strategy to show that a measurement may not have good validity. Now, another one is predictive validity, which is kind of how well the measurement predicts something that it should be related to in the future, and construct validity, which is how well the measure corresponds with other logically related variables. Let's look at examples of these because they're easier to understand by looking at particular examples. So I'm going to show you this from the book, which is the Consumer Sentiment Index, and this is a way to a good illustration of predictive validity. This measurement actually has pretty good predictive validity. Now, it's a measurement of consumer sentiment that's based on surveys that are conducted monthly with a pretty small sample, really, of 400 or so households in the United States. And they're asked a series of questions about their optimism about the economy. And what's interesting here is that if this is a valid measure of consumer sentiment, it ought to predict consumer behavior. Consumer spending is 2/3 of the U.S. economy, so one way to check the validity of it is if people are feeling optimistic, does the economy grow? If they're feeling pessimistic, does the economy shrink? So the blue line is the index. The yellow bars here are periods of economic recession, decline. So in between the yellow bars are periods of more periods of expansion. So as you can see, the measure turns down. The index of consumer sentiment dips down going into this recession and comes up going out of the recession. So people are feeling more optimistic and the economy comes out of recession. And look here, people are feeling more pessimistic and the economy drops into recession. Then they begin to feel more optimistic and the economy pulls out of recession. Here's a real clear example. Consumer sentiment drops drastically. There was a stock market crash during this period of time, and that tends to scare consumers, and they hold on to their wallets, and that put the economy into a recession in the early 90s. Here's the great expansion, throughout the later, early to late 90s and into the 2001 there was another recession. But again, you can see the consumer sentiment index dipping down. Probably the most telling thing is the last big economic crisis we just went through. And of course, there was lots of bad news, but one of the things that tipped the economy into recession, in addition to all the financial problems, was really consumer fear of losing their jobs or losing their savings. And that led to extreme drop in consumer sentiment, which was part of the reason the economy went into a bad recession, is because people just pulled back on their spending, stopped buying cars and appliances and houses and other things. So this is evidence that the consumer sentiment index has some predictive validity, even though it's simply a set of questions on a relatively small survey. And then construct validity can be illustrated with this data from the European Social Survey, which is a big random sample survey done in many countries in Europe, a couple dozen nations. And what is included in that survey is a self-reported health measure, which is pretty basic. It's just a question that says, on a scale of 1 to 4, how good is your health? Excellent, good, fair, poor. We think of excellent as coded 4, good 3, fair 2, poor 1. And we might want to know how valid is that as a measure of real health. That's a simple question on a survey. Well, health, we know from lots of good detailed medical evidence, is related to age. The older people are, the less healthy they tend to be. Diseases show up later in life. The body ages, and so health is clearly related to disease in a negative way, in the sense that more age should be related to less health. So one way to check the validity of this simple self-reported health measurement is to compare it to the age variable, which is also in the survey. And here, as we might expect, or if it's a valid measure of health, there's a good, strong negative relationship here, which means that the older people in the survey report less subjective self-reported health. The younger people in the survey report higher levels of health on this 4-point scale. And that's a pretty strong, this is a correlation coefficient. It basically represents the strength of the relationship. And this is moderately strong negative relationship. So it does indicate that this self-reported health measure is behaving like a valid measure of health should behave. That should be negatively related to age. And notice too that it's not related to ideology, political ideology, or religiosity. Another aspect of construct validity is the idea that it should be related to certain variables and not related to other variables, and this shows that.